Hello, everyone. Welcome here. Today, we are launching what we call Tghat Forum. And in this forum, we aim to have continuous discussions on very broad questions on the Horn of Africa, which we believe there are several problems in the Horn of Africa, and the strongest expression of these problems is the war on Tigray, and we believe that the war, which has now morphed into a genocidal campaign, is fundamentally about problems in state building, democracy, regional peace in the Horn of Africa, specifically in Ethiopia and Eritrea. And to move forward, it needs discussion on the different issues that have led to this war, the issues of peace, democracy, development, and state building. So Tghat Forum seeks to contribute to the understanding of these issues through genuine and honest conversations. And today is our first program on this. And hopefully we will continue to do these conversations and bring some understanding to the complex issues that have led to this war, and suggest solutions and pathways on the basis of this understanding. So today we will introduce the team members, and then we will move to discuss about the war on Tigray and how it is changing the Horn of Africa. So we will soon introduce the members, but today I'd like to say that myself, Gebre Christos Gebreslase, and Tghat Gebre Mikael are moderating the discussion for today, and Tghat will introduce our guests, who are also the members of the Tghat Forum that will continue to appear and continue to run the program. Tghat, take the floor and introduce our guests for today.
Thank you so much, Gabriel Christos, for the terse but very thorough introduction to Tghat. And to discuss the issues that Gabriel Christos raised, we have a wonderful array of panelists today. We have Chassie Baldwin, a PhD researcher at the University of Reading, United Kingdom. She focuses on conflict and post-conflict experience of the women of Tigray. That's her research interest, and she will give us her insight in that dimension. We also have Goitam Gabrielul, has a PhD from the University of Cambridge in political science and international relations. His particular interest is in nationalism, ethnicity, and interstate affairs. He has appeared on many international medias and also written for top papers and magazines like the Washington Quarterly, the Al Jazeera, and Washington Post. And finally, we have Patrick White, who has a PhD in political science and international development from the University of Guelph, Canada. He's written articles on Sudan and Ethiopia. And that's it for panelists. And thank you everybody for joining this panel discussion. If you would say a word about yourselves, please do so.
Well, hello, I'm Chassie Baldwin. And as I said, I am a PhD candidate in history from the University of Reading, and my research specialises in gender-based violence, displacement, militarism, and women's roles in war zones. And my thesis specifically explores narratives of conflict in Tigray from the Liberation War through to the current crisis. Pleased to be here today.
Thank you. Patrick?
Okay, my name's Patrick White. In terms of my research focus is what brought me to Ethiopia and Ethiopian politics first was that I was writing on the South Sudan peace process, and that was taking place in Ethiopia. And so from 2014 until 2019, I was doing research on South Sudan, but that involved mostly me being in Ethiopia and conducting research. So I was able to see the whole evolution from the end years of the EPRDF to Abiy's rise, and then now the onset of the war in Tigray from Ethiopia. And so I've shifted my focus since then to Ethiopia and the Tigray War.
Thank you.
Thank you, Taklai. So as you mentioned, I'm a political analyst. Been researching Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa for 10 years or so. Previously worked at Mekelle University about a decade ago, and I've been studying and working in the UK and Norway, and Addis Ababa also. My interests are in nationalism, democratization, and interstate rivalries. I wrote my PhD on Ethiopia's foreign policy in the region, and very happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you all. So we'll go straight to the topic of discussion of today. We will talk about the Tigray war, and I think the Tigray war could be understood in two fundamental terms, in my opinion. One way to see the war is in terms of the in terms of what other people have been discussing so far, in terms of the casualties, human casualties, and the material destruction that the media have been writing about. Thousands of people have been killed, millions of people have been displaced. The entire Tigray infrastructure has been demolished and destroyed. And we heard yesterday that they are conducting aerial bombardment of civilian targets. So there is this tragedy on the one hand, but I believe the media are doing a decent job of covering that aspect. Although to my utter horror, they still continue to call the thousands of human lives lost and the material destruction as collateral damage, as an inevitable consequence of war, although the government seems to be targeting civilians. But that as it may, at least there is enough coverage in that dimension. The other aspect I think that hasn't been given enough attention is in terms of the deeper problems that are finding expression in the war. And people seem to kind of perceive the war in Tigray as an isolated incident, as something that happened after the blue and doesn't have any underpinning problems. And I would put it to you to kind of briefly talk about what issues has the war brought to the fore. What are the things that should be discussed at a fundamental level in relation to the war in Tigray and in relation to the Ethiopian politics and its impact to the wider region of the Horn of Africa? I'll start with Chelsea.
Thank you. Yeah, well, in my opinion, the war is changing the Horn of Africa, particularly for women, in fundamental and enduring ways. And the prolific perpetration of sexual and gender-based violence during the conflict will have long-lasting consequences for affected women, families, and communities, not least through the detrimental psychological consequences, but also the physical ramifications for those who have endured fertility-related violence, have been rendered physically disabled, contracted sexually transmitted infections, and of course for those who have fallen pregnant through the attack. And the consequences of this abuse actually extend much further than individual survivors themselves, as the knock-on impact of this type of violence affects women's participation in social activities. It can prevent their engagement in education and in the workforce, depending on the injuries that they've sustained. And at the moment, the most conservative estimates suggest around 25,000 women have been subjected to sexual violence in this war. And as this type of violence is chronically underreported, we can project that the real number will be significantly higher. But I would argue that the perpetration of sexual violence in Tigray has ramifications for women beyond the region, as the war has created this kind of permissive environment for gendered abuse, which, if it is allowed to go unchecked, will continue to inform ideas about regulation of the female body, how women derive meaning through sexual encounters, and legitimize sexual violence as a weapon during all conflicts, both in total war and in domestic conflict. It's been well documented that domestic abuse rises in conflict and post-conflict settings. And I would say the threat of violence moving from the war front to the home is significant, and we should take that very seriously. I would also mention the changes the war has brought to civilians through mass displacement, grief, financial instability, and of course now through sustaining food for households. And history tells us that women and children are amongst the most critically impacted by displacement and famine, because they face the greatest obstacles to key survival methods like evasive movement, accessing money and information. The war has promoted mass female mobilization for what we would call pro-social activities, so activism, altruistic giving, and community organization. And while increased female socio-political participation is unequivocally a good thing, I would say that prolonged engagement in war has enduring consequences like trauma, PTSD, and other stress-related illnesses that are often overlooked in those not in the immediate conflict zone. So I think we need a holistic approach to understand the broader social consequences of this war as experienced directly and indirectly, to ensure we are not mistakenly conflating social participation with empowerment. And that brief overview is just, in my opinion, the most critical changes to the whole regional landscape that this war has brought about.
Indeed, yeah, women have been the most affected victims of this war, but hopefully we'll come back to some of the issues you raised. Jesse, I will go ask Patrick the same question. Patrick, please go ahead.
So in terms of the war, it's raised a number of issues that are related to my research. The first one that I could discuss would be in terms of international responses. So there's a lot of talk about how to prevent genocide or how to stop an ongoing genocide. But the Tigray war in a lot of ways has challenged our conceptions of what can and should be done in response to ongoing mass killings. So you've seen a general lack of response by the international community, and a lot of the mechanisms being sort of discredited in their inability to respond to the Tigray crisis. So in international relations, we often tend to put scholars into two camps, liberals and realists. And liberals are often very focused on the aspect of diplomacy, of viewing the international community as a set of actors that are working together towards a common broader goal, which usually is a very positive view of humanity. And realists are much more concerned about power interests and how intervention is driven by power and interests. And in terms of how to respond to ongoing ethnic cleansing, genocide, whereas a liberal might say what we need to do is to go through the diplomatic channels, a realist is going to tell you that essentially the only thing that is going to stop these events is countervailing power. And that comes through, in this case, the Tigray Defense Forces. And then there's a whole debate around the use of force by international actors, which is very controversial. And like which actors could intervene in a peacekeeping or a more direct military way, and whether that would be advisable or not. So we're going to debate all of those issues as we get deeper into them. And some of the other issues in terms of my research is just ideas of the state. This war has challenged our conceptions of the state and how the state was formed in Africa, and in terms of conflict resolution, how a lot of the conflicts in Africa are tied to how states were formed, and the way out of sort of intractable conflicts in Africa is potentially rethinking how states act, or how borders are drawn and formed, and how political communities and nation states are conceived of.
Yeah, indeed. when the war started, the government had many arguments in its disposal that was using to kind of dispel international calls to end the war and stuff. But everything has now boiled down to one argument. The government basically says that this is a sovereign matter and that the international community shouldn't infringe on Ethiopia's sovereignty. That is essentially the argument that they present to every accusation that is being leveled against them. And I know that you have done a vast research on when the sovereignty of a country can be said to have been compromised, and when international community has a right to intervene. And we will come back to these points later, I'm sure. But now let me go to Goitam and ask him the same question. Goitam, please go ahead.
Thank you, Taklai. So this war has been in many ways changing very fundamental features of politics in the Horn of Africa. But also the change, then the new futures aren't really new. So in my view, what we've done is we've gone back to the pre-EPRDF era in many ways. So the EPRDF, particularly after the Ethiopia and Eritrea War of 1998, spent much of the next couple of decades focusing on building diplomatic ties with their neighbors and reducing rivalries and building up diplomatic capital in the Horn of Africa and beyond. And that was really based on a very concrete foreign policy strategy that specifically set out to avoid military confrontations with their neighbors and manage rivalries through diplomatic means. And that was quite effective. So they managed their rivalry with Egypt by building up a network of allies in the Horn of Africa. Notably, Sudan was key, and that's how the Grand Renaissance Dam became a reality, actually. And so, you had a couple of decades of EPRDF foreign policy that focused on diplomacy in the Horn of Africa and building up a network of allies, with the one exception being Eritrea, of course. So what we've seen the last couple of years is that all of that has been turned upside down. So peace has been made with Eritrea, but at the price of all other relations. And particularly, this was building up the last 2-3 years, but it sort of culminated in what we have today with the war in Tigray. And the outcome, though it's different from the EPRDF past, is actually very characteristic of regional relations in the Horn of Africa. So what we saw was that immediately as the war began, the way Abiy Ahmed conducted his diplomacy was very typical, in a very sort of typical chauvinist, Ethiopianist way, by relying on force, being overtly confident, and having full or excessive source of reliance on his own military power. And the outcome of that was that Sudan was drawn into the war, and Egypt took advantage of that. And quickly, the war in Tigray became a regional crisis. So we sort of gone back to the future, essentially. And in many ways, both internally with the genocide in Tigray and with the regional relations, though, not to repeat myself, though it's different from the EPRDF era, it is the way both the Ethiopian state has conducted domestic and regional politics for much of the 20th century. So that's how I would look at this war.
Yeah, indeed. I think most commentators on Ethiopian politics agree that Abiy has made a a series of diplomatic blunders, and one of them was totally jettisoning African partnership and African diplomacy, and instead going to the wrong people in terms of forming alliances with Isaias Afwerki, for instance, and going to the Arab country who, for obvious reasons, have little regard for democracy and for principle-based diplomacy. I could go on and mention other mistakes that he has made in terms of diplomacy, but I'm sure you will return to them later, Goitom. But for now, I will relay the moderation to Gabriel Christos and leave the floor. Please, Gabriel Christos, carry on.
You're muted.
You muted. Gabriel, you muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Tghat, for the nice questions that you have asked our guests. So I'd like to continue here with Goitom. Goitom, you've said, and I think correctly, that in many ways we've gone back to the pre-EPRDF era, and that the result this time might not be the same. So let's just zoom in here a little bit. Abiy came to power on the back of the Oromo youth that were, asking for more autonomy, for more representation, for devolution of power. But we know now where he is, and you have the deadly genocidal campaign in Tigray. And there is a lot of attention now. I think the attention is mounting now, as we can see. Previously, it was very hard, for example, for a news coverage. But yesterday, for example, for the air strike that just happened in around Magala in Togoga, there's quite some coverage. And it seems like, to me, there's some kind of irritation. The irritation is like growing in the international community. So this deadly campaign in Tigray, great disappointment in Oromia. What is really the future for Ethiopia, Goitom? Can you just delve a little bit here into the scenarios that can that we can kind of like think of for like a couple of years from now, or I mean, I don't know, the future from now?
Thank you, Gabriel Christos. Very interesting question, and I think not enough people ask that question because it's quite important, and a lot of people take for granted that the status quo will continue. I think it's important to consider what the last 30 years or 30 years now actually of Ethiopian history were. That was an experiment. So a lot of people think that in 1991, EPRDF and OLF and others imposed multinational federalism on a population that wanted a unitary form of governance. But for a lot of the ethno-nationalists, whether the ONLF in the Somali region or OLF in Oromia and TPLF in Tigray, the options were really to break up, to partition Ethiopia, or to try the multinational federal structure. So they went for trying the multinational experiment. When that experiment fails, the fallback option is not going to be a unitary form of government. The fallback option for a lot of Ethiopians is going to be secession. And I don't think enough people appreciate that. Those Ethiopians that don't appreciate it for political reasons, because it doesn't fit their preferred view of the world. But a lot of outsiders, Westerners, don't know that history and appreciate that sentiment amongst Ethiopians. So the fact that this experiment is now failing should not be a source of joy for those that want to see Ethiopia hold together. And the way it's failing is also quite important. You know, it's not failing in a sort of moderate way where the nations of Ethiopia are incapable of coming to an agreement on, you know, how to govern themselves and then peacefully depart. It's failing because a group of people, unitary nationalists, have taken over the state and are imposing their views, not just through violence and repression, but through mass rape, ethnic cleansing, and the worst forms of repressions that exist according to the UN, genocide. So, you know, that's one dimension. Another one is what I think, you know, we need to appreciate the importance of this last experiment with democratization, the one Abiy Ahmed was leading. For a lot of people, the past 27 years before he came to power was autocratic simply because of the TPLF. So a lot of people, including myself, almost took for granted that we would be able to easily move over to a more democratic form of governance. Now, what we see is that the problem is really, really deep-seated, so deep that it's making people hopeless. So what we're seeing in different parts of Ethiopia is that there's a sense of being betrayed. There's a sense of being betrayed in the most horrific ways. You know, as I said, with the nature of the violence, and that has almost, I think, traumatized. Certainly, has traumatized the Tigrans, and it's also traumatizing the Oromos, and has made a lot of people lose hope, total hope, in the Ethiopian project. So, you know, to make it short, I think it's inevitable that some sort of change will come in terms of the boundaries and the state structure of Ethiopia. How, you know, what the outcome is going to be is difficult to say, but yeah, there are a lot of debates and ideas that are rotating amongst these publics that Western academics and journalists and diplomats aren't privy to. So what's interesting is that a lot of Tigrans have already sort of seceded in their minds. They're, you know, not entertaining the idea of Ethiopia as a reality anymore. And amongst people in the South, amongst many Oromo intellectuals and so forth, different types of configurations are also being discussed. I've heard talks about a Kush nation for Cushitic speaking peoples and so forth. You know, which one of these will materialize is a different question. But the very fact that a lot of people are having these discussions is indicative of something very important. So I, for one, I'm already preparing myself for that future, a post-Ethiopian future, so to speak. And I think anyone with a stake in the region in Ethiopia should really consider what that will look like. I'll stop there.
That is very interesting, Goitom, and a lot of points for me here. You just said, for example, that a lot of foreign, mostly for Western intellectuals, analysis, commentators, really miss indeed the history here that brought, you know, the APRDF era, and I mean, it's just like you said before, it's going back, and I don't know why repeating the same thing could be a solution. I mean, you can even start there, and that's really very, very interesting. But the other interesting thing also here is, you know, the lack of, I mean, what is a country, for example, without really some sense of, solidarity? I mean, in Ethiopia, we see one Spain is someone else's joy, apparently. And what I even find really amazing here is that communities that have a little bit, similar problems, like the, although there's a little bit of a cooperation between Tigrayans and Oromos, they all resent the current system, but they somehow can't, like, coordinate their efforts together. And to me, that says, even that, is kind of a problem that points towards really a different path for each of these nations in Ethiopia. But I think these are like very deep questions, and hopefully we will come back to these questions. And I want to engage here, Patrick. Patrick, you in your previous answer, you said, the Tigray war has basically discredited, a lot of organizations. Like, personally, I had a lot of belief, in these multilateral organizations, the African Union, the United Nations. It's a lot of these things, and all we can say about this now is, well, deeply concerned. Okay, for some of them, I mean, for the African Union, even that is not the case. But simply, I mean, I think this war has shown us some kind of really the hollowness in these organizations, that they don't mean anything really in practice. So that's one thing. But on the European Union and the United States, we see an increasing irritation. Like I said before, there is, for example, yesterday they had a statement on the Togoga airstrike and the civilian casualties there. That's very immediate. I don't think that has happened before. So to me, it seems that there is an increasing really disappointment and irritation, at how things are going on. So there's also this Eritrea, which has basically really violated, let's say, I mean, well, violated, since Ethiopia hasn't complained, we can't say it has violated, but it's in Tigray. It's causing a lot of human suffering there. So can we really expect, Patrick, some kind of international intervention? When can that happen? I mean, what can, let's say, the US and the African Union, the United States do if they continue, this path that they are following now? What can trigger them to action, and what could the action be? Could you really say a few in this regard? I give Patrick.
So there's two different types of interventions. If you're talking about like military intervention or non-military intervention. So if we're talking non-military intervention, there's really four different paths, I would say. The first one is essentially you'd have like a UN peace mission or some sort of regional protection force, as was sent to South Sudan by IGAD under the command of the UN mission there. But in that case, you would need the government's approval. You need the consent of the government, because peacekeepers aren't invaders, is the principle of UN peacekeeping, right? So that's almost off the table now, because Abiy has designated the TPLF a terrorist organization. He's not willing to negotiate with them. So that option is pretty much just off the table. A second option would be to go through the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN's Charter, and to authorize a form of military intervention under the responsibility to protect. So the responsibility to protect holds that state sovereignty is no longer absolute, that if a state isn't able to protect its civilians from genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, that the international community doesn't only have the right to intervene, but the obligation. This doesn't mean it has to be a military intervention, but some sort of intervention. But the problem with that second option is that it depends on the UN Security Council, and you have the 5 permanent members. They all have their own state interests that often conflict. And so getting that option is also not so much realistic. Your third option is to just run around the Security Council and have a military intervention anyways. That's what they did in Kosovo in 1999. And that intervention was controversial precisely for that reason. They did that because they couldn't get Russia and China on board. But that was a NATO intervention, and that raises all sorts of issues in terms of imperialist meddling in the Horn of Africa and all those sorts of questions. And the proper channels, you know. The fourth option is, in theory, probably the best option, which is to go through the African Union. The African Union has an East African standby force that it could theoretically send into Tigray. Through the AU's Constitutive Act, it actually has more power than the responsibility to protect, to intervene in states. And if it's the African Union, you don't have as much the issue of this is a neo-imperialist intervention, because it would be through the African member states. But you've seen, as you said, even less of a response from the African Union, because the state's interests and all of those things get in the way. It's that foreign policy isn't so much governed by what is right, it's governed by power and interests. In terms of non-military interventions, there's lots that can be done. I mean, just at least statements and putting pressure, and journalists documenting what is happening is important. So the African Union has launched an investigation. It's the next 3 months, it's going to be investigating the crimes. I think that's important because it's an independent investigation. The UN Human Rights Commission and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission have a joint process also to investigate. But documenting the crimes is very important. Another thing in the immediate term is humanitarian responses, because there's people starving, suffering today, right? And the government has been playing a game where it blocks access, particularly to the areas controlled by the TDF. And even now they're bringing up stories from the 1980s where supposedly the TPLF was using aid money to buy weapons. And they're using this as a way to delegitimize humanitarian aid, saying that if you give humanitarian aid, essentially you're giving assistance to the TPLF, and that, you know, we should essentially be choking off the areas that are controlled by the TDF and the people within them. Some of the other non-violent interventions would be sanctions. But you have to also be careful with sanctions, because in a lot of cases, they're used to not punish the right people. We should be punishing elites, not ordinary Ethiopians, right? And sanctions in Cuba, for instance, as much as you can criticize the regime in many ways, the idea of choking off an entire society economically is very problematic. And what are the motivations actually behind that? Are they actually, you know, to change the government of Cuba and its human rights abuses? I don't think so, right? So when we're talking about sanctions, they really need to be targeted towards the elites. And so far, what we've seen with the United States' response is that they have been things like revoking officials' ability to enter the United States and to travel, and revoking IMF and World Bank and US loans is another thing that's on the table that they're discussing. So these are all some of the pressure points, the non-military pressure points that could be put on the Abiy regime. But up until now, we've seen very little. I'm Canadian, and the Canadian government has done nothing so far. I've been extremely disappointed. The American government now, under Biden, has started to make more moves. And I think that's explained by a number of factors. You have the fact that they do have historic alliances with the EPRDF regime, but also the Biden administration is increasingly concerned with what's becoming clear to everyone is an exterminationist campaign being conducted by Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Amhara militias. And they're also concerned about regional instability. The idea that Ethiopia is the linchpin of the region, and if Ethiopia implodes, it won't actually implode, it will explode throughout the region and create instability throughout the region. And that's what we're seeing right now. So we are seeing the United States acting more now, whether it's for benevolent reasons or not, we can debate, but we're seeing more productive actions from the United States now than any other actors. The one actor I didn't mention is the regional actors, IGAD, which essentially was the EPRDF regime's creation as a means to mediate conflict in the Horn of Africa region. And with the alliance, the tripartite alliance that's formed between Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, essentially Tghat is defunct in its conflict resolution capacity.
Yeah. Well, there are several organizations. I mean, Tghat is, I think, is dead. But then you have the next level, the African Union. Well, it's now trying to do some investigation. Let's see where that leads. But so far, it has been really a disappointing response from the African Union. I'd like to pose this question for both, especially for all of you, but especially Patrick and Goitom. What does this really, especially the Tigray war, mean for Eritrea, given that Eritrea is really accused of all these atrocities in Tigray, and given that it is really, I mean, there's a deep, sentiment and resentment, here in Eritrea, both with, previously it was against the Amharas, now it's against the Tigrayans. So I really kind of like want a short thing here, your views. What does it mean for Eritrea? I mean, like in the long term, what does it mean to be involved in this level, and to be committing these crimes? What does it mean for its sovereignty, for example?
Go first.
Yeah.
Interesting question, and I think the first thing that came to my mind was that it's really exposed what Eritrea is. I mean, what Isaias Afwerki's regime is essentially. It has sort of laid out the key features of that regime, and the fact that it's essentially a warlord with an army, and that's it. And the fact that economically, the main sort of the main economic activities is renting out mercenaries to Ethiopia, to the UAE. It's renting out land for military bases, essentially a war economy, right? And there's nothing else beyond that. And then the third thing is, of course, loot. And it's really, medieval type of state structure that you see here, right? You sell people, you rent out people, you go, you loot, and that's your sort of biggest achievement. That's your biggest source of pride and source of income, which is quite extreme and almost unparalleled, I have to say, in the world today. So it really exposed the fact that it's neither a proper state and not a nation, really. The disregard, I think, what we as Tagaru and the international community should also consider is that this is as much a war on the Eritrean people, to be honest. Isaias Afwerki has been committing all sorts of atrocities on the Eritrean people, and he's sending in young men against their will to Tigray to be murdered and to murder. And so in the long term, when this continues, post Isaias, I'm not sure how much of Eritrea there will be left, to be honest. Demographically, and also I suspect the political legacy would be much more divisive than even Abiy Ahmed's Ethiopia. So there's a tendency, I think, internationally and in the region to not consider what Isaias Afwerki has been doing to the Eritrean people and what he's doing to the Eritrean people now. And I would just say that I'm not sure there will be much left of Eritrea once he's done with it. So I'll quit that.
Interesting. Patrick, just like I want to modify a little bit the question here. Given what Goitom has said and what Eritrea, as we all have been following, has been doing, I'd like to ask this. I mean, like, this is probably something that hasn't happened, in the history of, the modern history of states and nations. But when does really a country lose a right to be a country? I mean, is there something like that?
Well, so the thing is that oftentimes whether a country is recognized by the international community has nothing to do with the empirical qualities of statehood. So if we're talking about what a state is, there's really three main things. There's that militarily you control an area, right? That's like Max Weber's idea of a monopoly of violence, the realist view of a state. It's about power. You actually control this territory, right? Your second way of viewing a state is like Benedict Anderson's idea of the imagined community, which is about legitimacy, the more constructivist view of like, we view ourselves as being a common political community and as being one. And your third way of viewing a state is the juridical state. It's international recognition as a state. And so in the modern world, in the post-colonial world, when states became independent, there was this agreement by sort of the international community and African leaders that we're going to kind of keep the borders the same. It's in our best interest to do that. And so what you've seen is that in terms of officially like juridical statehood, it can't really be revoked. Because look at Somalia. Somalia hasn't had a central government effectively since 1991 to a large part, but Somaliland, an empirical state in terms of both the realist and the constructivist views, is not recognized as a state. And so you do see that there's almost nothing that a state leader can do to have his power revoked. And a lot of what you see of the conflict that drives, or what drives conflict in post-colonial Africa, is this disjuncture between the empirical state and the imagined community with the juridical state. And so you have all of these sort of artificial states where the leader doesn't actually project power throughout the entire of its nominal territory, right? So the central government is constantly going to war with various regions, trying to make them submit. And the regions view themselves more through their subnational identities, and they're always trying to exert their autonomy from the central government. And also there's this constant attempt by African leaders, like Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire was the biggest example, where they're trying to create this idea of national identity. And we're really seeing it in Ethiopia, this one Ethiopia sort of national identity that's being forced upon people in a way that is really sort of viewed as an assimilationist project. And so that creates conflict. And so for the international community, oftentimes it's whoever's sitting in the capital city, no matter how much power they actually project, no matter how much legitimacy they have, or how sort of dysfunctional sort of like the state is in terms of the various nations that it comprises. No matter what the ruler does, they'll be supported as the official ruler of that entire territory. And so that's where a lot of conflict in Africa comes from my perspective.
Very indeed interesting. So once you become a state, there's no way to to lose that, it seems. I think here I'd like to bring Jesse here. Jesse, you mentioned the conflict and what it means on women and its impact on the Horn of Africa. Maybe here I would like you to give us a little bit more insight in, for example, what it means, for example, for the soldiers from Eritrea and Amhara and also Ethiopia, like really exercising this, this sexual violence in Tigray. I mean, they'll go back to their places, and this is kind of like, they are educated in some way, they are changed in some way, and I kind of like think that this will be really have a consequence in their communities when they go back. But beyond that, I mean, how can, for example, yes, it will probably help us, talk about this, maybe as time goes back in the entire Horn of Africa. I think in Tigray, we are learning now a lot what this means for us, for Tigrayans, and for the Tigrayan women. But beyond that, really, what are the specific things that the Tigray sexual violence can impact? The Eritrea and Ethiopia, and maybe even beyond.
Yeah, well, let me first, to answer that, let me explain a little bit about historically how sexual violence works in war, because that's really key to understanding that question. So we know that violence comes in multiple forms and serves multiple functions in war as it does in peace. But when a perpetrator chooses to deploy gendered or sexual violence, they are selecting a very specific expression of domination. So there's a very deliberate enactment of hierarchy, a violation that we know has consequences far outlasting the act itself. So in other words, when sexual or gender-based violence is perpetrated during a conflict, we have to understand that method of violence is a choice, which has specific strategic functions within the parameters of that conflict. And that's what we mean when we speak about weaponized rape, right? So rape is a method of warfare that is separate in function, execution, and treatment from other forms of warfare like bombardment, detention, or weaponized starvation, and so on. And as we mentioned earlier, this all too frequent allegation of sexual violence in war is that it is an unfortunate but inevitable kind of collateral or opportunistic by individuals. And this is just historically untrue. And there are a lot of cases that we can draw on where sexual violence was not perpetrated on a wide scale during conflicts. And this is particularly during instances where insurgent groups rely on civilian assistance or aspire to positions of governance within their community. So we saw this in El Salvador, in Peru, Colombia, Sri Lanka, and actually in Tigray itself during the Liberation War in the 70s and 80s. So although there were other quite specific forms of violence that characterize those conflicts, sexual violence is notably absent. And I would also want to pick up on instances of sexual violence in conflict that, while constituting what we would call a crime against humanity, are not genocidal in their intentions, because they are not conducted with the aim of destroying a specific group. So the rape of German women by retreating Soviet soldiers in World War II, or the use of comfort women, which is a euphemism for sexual slavery, by the Imperial Japanese Army, and in Sierra Leone, when rape was used as an initiation tactic to bind men and women to the rebel forces. And these abuses are war crimes, and in some cases we can call them ethnically motivated violence, but they are not genocidal, because their aim was not the destruction of the affiliated group in its entirety. Whereas we would look at Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda, of course, in the early 1990s, where sexual violence was conducted with specific genocidal intentions, sometimes overtly through forced pregnancy, and of course fertility-related violence, which stops women from being able to have children at all within their ethnic distinction. And it also destroys, we have to recognize the homogeneity of the affected group by preventing reconstructing and rebuilding of that society through shame. And of course, shame is one of the most persisting obstacles to women as they attempt to move forward from sexual violence. And in Rwanda, people were persecuted for those crimes under the name of genocide. Of course, most notably Jean-Paul Akayesu. So to classify sexual violence as an inevitable or opportunistic practice of warfare is really to misunderstand and obscure the functions of sexual violence in conflict. And that's why it's really important to understand sexual violence in the Tigrayan context in its regional history. And this is where we can think about the implications for Eritrean soldiers, because some of the most recent analysis that we've been able to do from the data, which is, to be fair, limited, is that there are very different functions of sexual violence for different perpetrating forces. So we know that Eritrean forces are tending to pursue what we would call multiple actor rape or gang rape and sexual slavery. And that is consistent historically with other conflicts in which ethnic cleansing is a primary force, but also when the organization of sexual violence comes from the highest level. And I would say that that carries implications for the way that we think about how the Eritrean efforts have been organized, in that it is coming from an order, whether that's explicit or whether that's just an accepted practice is something that we'll have to consider later down the line. But I would say that that carries implications for how we can assume Eritrean soldiers as individuals are conducting these war crimes. Whereas we've seen in Amhara militia, much more fertility-related violence, and that comes down to, we would call that specific type of ethnic cleansing, from preventing Tigrayan women from being able to carry Tigrayan children or carry children at all, regardless of ethnic distinction. So even if we can draw parallels between the sexual violence that's happened from different perpetrating groups, it's really important to disaggregate the experiences of sexual violence in this war as a unit, categorized by their violence, and place them in their specific regional, but also individual level of conflict. So to holistically distinguish the needs and the possible routes for justice as well, which is really important to think about as we move forward. But to answer the second part of your question about how the impacts of this on the whole Tigrayan community as they attempt to move forward is what we would call secondary impacts of conflict. So as I mentioned at the beginning, disrupted education, workforce, and of course marriage trajectories is something to think about when financial stability, prosperity is tied to marriage for a woman, and whether that violation of her body and the enduring implications of shame will disrupt that for her. And I would really stress the impact of gendered violence becoming domestic violence as well, collectively and in the home, as women's bodies are kind of legitimized as a potential and effective battlefield. And the ramifications of this, I think we felt most immediately in the surrounding areas of the Horn, but I think it carries meaning for women everywhere.
Yeah. That is indeed really, especially in like you said, in Tigray, where still women are very much economically they rely on this social status and how they marriage and all these things. Really, I mean, I know what it means for a woman, let alone to be really sexually raped. To be suspected of something like that means to have no chance at marriage, and the consequences are really extremely devastating. But Chelsea, that is like what it means for Tigray. Does it have an impact, for example, for the people outside Tigray? Can you say a few things about that? For example, for Eritreans themselves, not just only for the people that are participating in the war, but also for the community outside. Because one way, for example, that I see is that the people will go, or well, at least some of them will go back to their communities in Eritrea. The Amharas, they will go as well. Mm. And so they are taking this type of, experiment, this type of exercise. So I see that, for example, this has an impact in the broader region, because these people will go back there to their communities. But are there other ways that the Tigray conflict, this sexual aspect, this sexual violence, can impact the region beyond Tigray?
Absolutely. And the first, as you mentioned, the first one that we need to think about is for the returning soldiers. And that is what I mean when I say that we have to disaggregate how these acts of genocide have been carried out, whether it has been organized by individual militia units or whether it has come from a higher level. And we know that Eritrean forces specifically have a very high proportion of what we would call child soldiers, or very, very young men and women, I believe, who have been involved in this type of violence. And that has long-term implications for their mental well-being. And we saw this in Sierra Leone in the types of ways that they can seek to reconstruct as individuals within their community, having been involved in this type of violence, which frankly, especially for women that have been involved in this violence, carries very long-term implications for how they're able to reintegrate, having disrupted that category of woman to soldier to a perpetrator of violence is immense. And also for the communities that they return home to, who themselves were not guilty of these crimes, but are in some ways implicated by their associations, by their identity, by their nationality, by their ethnicity in these crimes, and what that means for that community to try and move forward. And that's why understanding that link between wartime sexual violence and domestic violence is really key, because there is a very clear, we saw it in South Africa, we saw it in Liberia, a very clear correlation between perpetration of violence in war and perpetration of violence in the home front. as well. I think that's going to be really critical as we look to move forward. And of course, I think the most important thing to realize is that these are not issues for women to deal with as women. These are issues for the whole community, and it's so integral to the makeup of the conflict, of the pattern, of the future, of the trajectory, that we have to think about this as a community level issue and not one for women to combat on their own.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of issues. Hopefully we will explore these issues in more depth as we go further. Tghat, maybe you want to engage our guests. I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice discussion. I would actually want Chessie, while we are at it, if we could talk about another aspect of the gender-based violence in Tigray. The fear now is that thousands of women have already been raped. That is what the figures seem to suggest. And it looks like that the government troops or the government soldiers have, as a matter of policy, to retaliate on civilians whenever they lose on the battlefront. And one of the retaliation techniques is they go around and rape women, and the figure could go to many tens of thousands. Now, that is egregious enough, but although that was enough, another devastation to that is that some of them will be traumatized, of course, and some of them will inevitably be pregnant, and they will have babies. That's something that will for sure happen, and it's not going to be something that the women, on broadly speaking, going to be happy about. And Tigray generally is a very conservative society. We don't have in our repertoire the tools to address and to talk about these issues. But if you could speak about if there is any scholarly literature or experience in dealing with this kind of situation, in terms of helping women, in terms of dealing with this problem, in terms of addressing it, in terms of avoiding stigma, which will for sure happen. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and one that I would like to begin by saying I don't think that it is all negative experience. Obviously, the thing that is going to be absolutely critical to ensuring a positive, successful long-term reintegration experience is justice. And that is made particularly difficult in this war by the fact that you have 3 or more perpetrating groups. And we know that there have been accusations that Eritrean soldiers have been wearing Ethiopian uniforms. So it's going to be even more difficult to identify perpetrators because of that deliberate misdirection and confusion for victims, which is in itself a strategy of this war. So centralizing the justice experience is going to be absolutely essential for women to be able to move forward from this. And there are a number of ways that we could do that. And I'm sure Patrick will talk a bit more in his future sessions about UN tribunals and the International Criminal Court. But there are also things that can be done at a community level. And we saw that most effectively done in Rwanda, obviously, with the Tghat courts. And also truth and reconciliation commissions can be a really effective way when there has been widespread violence with multiple perpetrators doing various levels of abuses and identifying where the roots of that have come from in order to prosecute the right people for the right crimes. And I think that one thing that is often overlooked and last on the agenda, but is really critical specifically for women, is reparations. And that's extremely ethically problematic when you think about how you put a price on the abuse that someone has endured. But when you think about the long-term implications for women who will then miss out on education, who will then have difficulties in the workforce, and as we discussed, the importance of marriage for that long-term prosperity, reparations can be a really effective way of addressing some of those problems for women. Now, there is something that we would call a resilience model that I think is quite encouraging in the Tigrayan context, where communities that are known to have very intricate support networks and have gone through conflict before, which we know is the case in the Tigray community, are able to rebuild quite effectively through what we would call like homeotopic continuity. So resilience begetting resilience. Other elders who have gone through the previous wars are able to encourage and speak with the youth. And what the other thing that I would think is really encouraging in this context is the youth diaspora movements we've seen be so phenomenal in their organizational efforts, but also to raise this issue of sexual violence and talk about how we can remove that stigmatization of shame from within the communities and not expect that to be imposed through the health professionals that will work with the women, but actually coming from within the community and how the community can identify that. And faith, of course, is a big one for a particularly conservative society where there are community elders that women will feel close to, will I believe, play a big role moving forward as we look to heal.
Yeah, interesting. I think you have raised very, very big and interesting topics, and I will leave them there hanging in the interest of time. But if you have time, we will return and cover some of the points. But now I will jump to Patrick. I was reading one of the articles that you wrote about South Sudan and the peace process and the peace deals there, Patrick. And one of the things that you say in the article is one mistake that people generally make when they make peace deals is they exclude some stakeholders that you call spoilers, I think. And when you do that, the spoilers will come and spoil the whole thing. It doesn't work if you don't involve the whole process. And I could think of two critical examples in Ethiopia. One was when Abiy Ahmed struck the peace deal with Eritrea. He excluded the TPLF and Tigrayans in general. So that was one case of exclusion. And another one is that the election the sham election, I should rather say, that Ethiopia had a couple of days ago, where the huge swathe of the country was essentially excluded. And we could, thinking the election as something which is similar to peace deal, significant stakeholders in the country have been excluded. Do you think do you think that excluding the TPLF was a huge problem in terms of precipitating the war, and excluding now the Oromos, the Tigrayans, the Somalis from the election will have similar kind of negative effects in Ethiopia?
Yeah, in terms of that inclusion-exclusion debate, that's a pretty central one in terms of conflict resolution. My perspective on that is actually a bit critical. The literature often presents it as if the key to lasting peace is just to include a lot of actors into a peace process, and then that's sort of the way forward. In South Sudan, I was really critical of that because there was an attempt to include the various stakeholders, civil society, women's groups, other political parties. But what you saw happen in actuality was that the actors that had the military power controlled the peace process and pushed the others out. And so as much as a broader goal, inclusion is something that we should all strive towards, and you're not going to really see lasting peace without an inclusive government. That peace process that attempt to be inclusive often encounter many difficulties just because the reality is that what a peace process is negotiating between military forces. And what makes you able to impose yourself at the negotiating table is your military power. And I kind of feel like in terms of the Ethiopia and Tigray, I kind of see things the same way in terms of course, the ideal world would be to have a government that says, we're going to have this national reconciliation process, and we're going to get everyone together. It's going to be inclusive, and every community is going to be heard, and we're going to do our best, because you can't really resolve every dispute in Ethiopia in one peace process, because some demands are mutually exclusive, right? Many of them are. But that would be the way forward. But in the absence of the government being willing for that, the international community just sort of saying that inclusive dialogue is the answer is sort of like an empty phrase that they just say. But what does that actually mean? And in terms of the realities of power, is there a way to actually convince a government to hold an inclusive process that is respecting of all of the peoples of Ethiopia, if it doesn't want to, without some sort of countervailing force? And so in the case of Tigray, the argument would be that the only way you're ever going to get Abiy to really come to the negotiating table and talk with you is if you show him that you're stronger than him and that he has to negotiate with them.
Yeah. Yeah, another issue that if you could, while we're at it, Patrick.
I think we, in the interest of time, maybe we can make it a bit short.
Yeah, so Patrick, you will make sure that you finish it within a minute.
Sure.
The responsibility to protect, it seems to me that it is conditioned on the state failing to give protection, right? That's what it means. And I'm wondering who gets to decide when a state has failed to protect its citizens, and what is the mechanism that you follow to arrive at that conclusion? Because that seems very significant in the case of Ethiopia, because what they are saying is they are giving protection to Ethiopia. What they are doing is getting rid of terrorists who would otherwise be risks to the civilians, right? That's the Ethiopian government's argument. But Tigrayans at least would say that the state has failed in its responsibility to protect. But who gets to decide that, and how is the process?
Well, in terms of military intervention, it's the UN Security Council that decides. But the responsibility to protect as a broader theme and idea is something that universally applies to every state everywhere. It's just the idea that wherever there's a state that is not fulfilling its responsibility to protect civilians from international crimes, that the international community has an obligation to respond in some way, right? What way is that is up for debate. Who should respond in what way? When we're talking military action, it's really through the UN Security Council. But when we're talking about like state sovereignty, there's a lot of different ways we can conceive of like state sovereignty. So the way that's often put forward by like Abiy supporter is basically the few elites that control the state in Addis Ababa, the interests of those people are the interests of the state, and that, you know, if any other foreign government or institution criticizes them, then they're violating Ethiopia's state sovereignty. But another way of viewing state sovereignty is the idea of like popular sovereignty, people's sovereignty. That gets a lot more complicated because people's views are not all the same. But when we're talking about the Tigray War in particular, and we're talking about which government the people of Tigray tend to support, whether it's the Abiy government or their regional government, I think we're all very clear in terms of what the popular opinion is on that one. And in terms of statehood and secession, it's also becoming very clear where the people of Tigray stand on that one. So when we're talking about those two issues, as far as I'm concerned, the opinions of other Ethiopians are of no consequence. Do Tigrayans want their government back, and do they want a state? And the only people who should really have a legitimate state in that, if we're talking about people's sovereignty, would be the people of Tigray.
Thank you. So if you could have Goitom enlighten us on one topic, and then we wrap up the conversation. Would you allow me, Christos?
Yeah,
to
we can have one. Yeah.
I think it's a very important topic that I would ask Goitom now. So you briefly mentioned earlier, Goitom, that some sort of loosening of the structure that Ethiopia has now is inevitable and is required anyway. Whether that is a loose form of federation or confederation or a total breakaway of states, I don't know. But my question to you is, what I sometimes, because I hear sometimes people say that pushing for independence or for a looser version of the federalism that Ethiopia has now, or of the federation, is a cop-out answer. It doesn't solve any of the problems that we have. We should have a hard look into problems and try to solve them within the current framework. So what, in your opinion, are the problems that wouldn't be solvable with the current framework that would become easier with a different structure, with a looser form of structure? I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah. So, and it's a really good example. It's a really good question, you know, because recent experience with secession, for example, in the Horn of Africa is not particularly good. Looking at South Sudan and Eritrea, to some extent, Somaliland's difficulties in attaining recognition all point to the fact that, you know, this is not really an ideal solution. So what then? You know, what's the alternative? I think one has to ask, you know, at what point is a society sort of inherently dysfunctional? What are the issues that cannot be negotiated and compromised? And the divisions amongst the two nationalist camps in Ethiopia, the unitary nationalists and the multinationalists, is a perfect example. These are two ideas that are inherently incompatible. And I often thought that it would be possible to find some sort of third way, which involved a little bit of compromise from both, that would be functional, but it doesn't seem to be that way, or that doesn't seem to be the case, because it goes beyond sort of being, for example, looking at unitary nationalism, it goes beyond being against multinational federalism, and it goes beyond wanting a unitary nation. What I mean by that is it actually has a cultural component. The cultural nation that it wants to promote is Amhara culture, it's Abyssinian imperial history, and so forth, right? So it's not, you know, the notion of unity that is being promoted is not culturally neutral. It's a particular culture. So, and for a variety of reasons, a lot of people in Ethiopia find that unacceptable. Third factor is also that what we've seen the last 2-3 years, and particularly during the Tigray crisis, is the willingness or the length these nationalists are willing to go to pursue that political project. They're willing to rape, they're willing to engage in ethnic cleansing, they're willing to engage in mass murder in the 21st century. And as they're doing that, what we have also seen is the religious establishment, the intellectual establishment, has an incredibly nonchalant attitude toward this type of violence. So, and I think it's going to be very difficult to accommodate that. It's difficult for me personally, or impossible, I should say. I think it's going to be impossible for Tigrayans to do that. And I suspect it's going to be impossible or difficult for Oromos and a number of other nationalities. And that's why I think what Abiy Ahmed is doing now is extremely important. I don't think people appreciate just how important it is, because for a lot of people, this is the moment where we sort of gave up on the prospects of Ethiopia because of the zero-sum nature of it, because of their insistence on taking the whole pie, because of their sort of total disregard for any form of morality, any international humanitarian law, or anything. So yeah, for these reasons, I think it's going to be to compromise.
A related issue that that I hope one day you return and enlighten us, Goitom, is that there seems to be, to me at least, one blurred line in Ethiopia, and that is the distinction between state and nation. Now, the government people seem to believe that Ethiopia is a nation state. There was a perfect example of that when an ambassador representing the government said 2 or 3 days ago that Ethiopia is home to people who share blood and culture and religion, whatever that means. It doesn't make sense, really. But he was implying that Ethiopia is a nation rather than just a state, whereas people with brain cells would say that Ethiopia is just a hodgepodge of people with fundamentally different values who would be better off at least being a little bit with more autonomy. But we will return to those aspects. For now, I will leave the floor to Gabriel Christos to wrap up the panel discussion. I think we have taken more time than we had planned for.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think we have to close now. It's an interesting discussion. A lot of issues we would like to go in more detail. But just before I close, maybe I should give our panelists 1 minute each to kind of like, if they want to add an extra point or wrap up their points. And then with that, I think we can close. So just, you know, because we have been going a little bit deeper, we are talking about the war in Tigray, the war, the Tigray war. Well, some people say the war in Tigray, but actually, personally, I prefer the war on Tigray, and the changing Horn of Africa. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to wrap up your thoughts or add points you haven't mentioned before, and then with that we're gonna wrap up. Anybody can take the first chance.
I can go.
Yeah, go ahead.
No one's willing. I want to go because I want to actually wrap up by answering Tghat's last point, which is very important and very fascinating, and also extremely annoying. The ambassador's remarks and that way of thinking. So essentially, I think the problem with unitary nationalist view of the nation is that there is no room for agency, right? Because the thing is, I studied nationalism, and we looked at the history of nationalism and nationhood throughout history, and no one can sort of come up with a set of criteria that sort of are consistent across cases for being a nation. And what it essentially boils down to is a willingness by a group of people to see themselves as a nation. So agency is essential. There is no cultural criteria, there is no language criteria, and so forth that is consistent across cases. And at the end of the day, nationhood is just a form of community. And any form of community must be based on the agency of the individuals involved. They have to accept that particular community as legitimate. And that is, I think, the problem with unitary nationalism. The agency of the Ethiopian people is irrelevant to them. What Ethiopians, the living, breathing entities that inhabit that territory, whatever view they would have about Ethiopia is of no relevance. Ethiopia is seen as some sort of idea that floats above and beyond human beings, on which or about which the inhabitants cannot have a view, or it's not sort of dependent on our acceptance, so to speak. And that is, of course, not compatible with the 21st century or any century, I think, because nationhood is essentially, one thing that differentiates it from empire and other forms of political entities is that acceptance and persuasion is essential in this form of political community. So I'll stop there.
That's a very interesting point, Gautam. Ethiopia is beyond Ethiopians, something that floats. And if it comes down a little bit, I think it comes down, it touches a little bit Addis Ababa, I believe. And the rest of the country is really, it doesn't matter. But again, a lot of issues here. We will come back. Patrick, 1 minute. Would you like to wrap up your thoughts here?
Yeah, so I would just say that, like, jumping off of Gautam's points, like that the root causes of conflict in Africa, people debate this and have so many different theories, but for me, it really comes down to how states were formed through the colonial fracture, how not only the drawing of political borders and communities fractured them, but the imposition of European modes of thought and governance on these societies, the manipulation of identity groups, placing one above the other, and all these sort of power politics. A lot of the conflict in Africa stems from that. And the thing that I've always found interesting is the people who cite Kwame Nkrumah and the idea of anti-imperialism, they often think that the idea of keeping the borders the same is an anti-imperialist argument. In a lot of ways, the reason why they're making that is because the initial secessionist movements were like in Congo, where it was like a very resource-rich area that the imperial powers were trying to steal away from a country to continue controlling the resources, right? But in the modern day, when you think about secession, a lot of times it's really people distinguishing themselves against what they see as an oppressive central government and wanting to have regional autonomy. And so in that sense, the idea that forcing states to stay together, to me, is actually like a form of sort of neocolonialism in its own right. So I just kind of feel that the way the borders were made is sort of what drives conflict, but that doesn't mean that just redrawing borders is the automatic solution. That it's sort of like a Humpty Dumpty problem. Once everything's been broken, it's hard to put it back together again. But the central way forward is to think about political communities, nations, states, and that as much as we might not have the answer, it's not a simple answer, but that those are the questions that we need to be asking.
Very big point here. Yeah, Chezi, I give you as well 1 minute, and then we are wrapping.
I will be brief. Yeah, well, this has been a great discussion, and I really look forward as we go forward with these sessions to talk about the other gendered dimensions of the war that we haven't brought in today. Namely, there has been gendered violence against men and boys, and we haven't discussed that today, but I hope that we will do as we move forward. And I just want to briefly stress that although we've talked about the issues facing women at the moment, these are not women's issues to be considered in isolation, and they are so intertwined with the makeup of pattern and the future of this conflict that a gendered lens is going to be really critical as we look to move forward. And I look forward to discussing that with all of you in more depth.
Thank you so much. I like this conversation, and I hope we will go in depth in many of these issues. Today, what we have done is we have launched the Tghat Forum, but we have also just immediately jumped into discussing the issue, mainly the broader issues. Not really, we didn't focus so much on the detail, although really we have talked a lot of details as we go. But the point for today is that we want to touch the big issues about the Tigray war and its impact in the broader region, how it is changing the region. And I think we have touched many points here. And as we go in our next discussions, we'll come back to many of these issues and discuss them in detail. But for today, I think we should stop here. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming and sharing your insights here. And I look forward to discuss these issues with you as we go forward. Thank you so much. And for today, we stop here. Thank you.